She was once the oldest ship afloat, the fastest sailing ship in Asia, the most feared pirate ship in the Chinese waters. Now, the very last pieces of her lie in a foot of low-tide mud on the windward side of Cat Harbor, Catalina Island, California. After 159 years of terrorizing the high seas, and then an additional century of legends, it all comes down to this.
That's her.
This small stump of dense wood protruding from the sand. This is the Ning Po, formerly the Qin Typhoon. Very little of the early history of this ship that we're going to go into can be confirmed with certainty. There are no logs or manifests of this ship, and the only knowledge that we do have about the ship's escapades come from British and Imperial Chinese forces, their records, whenever they clashed with the Qin Typhoon. What we do know for sure is her sturdy construction, her unmatched speed, and at the time of her demise, she was the oldest still functional vessel still afloat. She was built in either 1753 or 1773, though more reliable evidence indicates the older date of 1753. Built in the Chinese city of Fuzhou under the Qing dynasty, the ship was initially named the Qin Typhoon, meaning the Golden Typhoon. 138 feet long and 291 tons, she was built of ironwood and camphor without using a single metal nail in her construction. Rather, she was fitted together with precise joinings and the occasional wooden dowel to secure the pieces. She was crafted to look like a fearsome sea monster, with an open mouth at the bow adorned with two silver discs resembling eyes. She curved like a dragon with an ornately carved stern that looked like a tail. Officially, she was launched as a merchant ship, but she very quickly turned smuggler and slave trader. Now, I honestly have to assume that that was the intention with her right from the start, given her fearsome appearance and the dense armored wood that she was built with. Now, there's no records indicating that it is the intention that they built her with, but come on, we can read between the lines. Cannons could not penetrate her. Flaming arrows had no effect. Pursuing ships could not catch up with her. She was like a ghost stalking the Chinese coastline. Her crew would quietly sail her into an unsuspecting coastal village at night and unleash havoc, pillaging the locals and kidnapping girls for slavery into other parts of China. When various rebellions sprung up around China, the Qin Typhoon sailed up the rivers to join the fighting, on whichever side was more profitable, taking more slaves along the way. Imperial records state that at some times she was carrying up to 400 female slaves on board to the market. She was captured by Imperial forces on multiple occasions and even partially burned in 1814, each time being repaired and broken free from her confiscators, unleashing a new wave of terror with each outbreak. Her atrocities were so heinous that in 1834 the British Royal Navy stepped in. When Lord William Napier was sent over to China to expand British trade with the Empire, he was given the side quest of capturing the Qin Typhoon, and he did it. The boy actually did it. But then he died a few weeks later and they stole it back. 7 years later, she was captured once again by Imperial Chinese forces, and this time they decided that she would be used as a punishment tool herself against the pirates who served aboard her. She was used as a prison ship for a few years, and legend has it that her Imperial Chinese occupying captain, who was overseeing the prison on board, grew tired of the cost and the labor involved in feeding the 158 captives he had on board. Some of them were the former pirate crew of the ship. So he ordered all of his men to bring them up on deck and beheaded them right there on the spot. This might be nothing more than legend, however. There's no way to confirm this. In 1861, she was captured by British-led rebel forces. At this point, over 100 years since her construction, the Qin Typhoon was given a new, inacrimonious name by the capturing commander, a British colonel by the name of Peter Gordon. He renamed her the Ning Po, meaning peaceful waters. I guess he was hoping that that name might rub off on her and sort of calm her down, but it didn't work at all. She was wrecked in a typhoon that same year, quickly rebuilt, and then served in the Third Battle of Nanking in the Taiping Rebellion. After that battle, however, she retired to a life of peace, offering European tourists luxury cruises out around the Hong Kong harbor. Now, if you believed that one, you would have fallen for the same trap that they did. What she was actually doing was luring European tourists under that premise, taking them out to sea, robbing them of everything that they had, and then ditching them on a deserted island offshore. Well, some of those tourists survived and made it back to Hong Kong and reported this to the British Admiralty. By this point, the British were ruling Hong Kong, and also by this point, the British were so sick of this pest that was roaming the Chinese waters that they sent one of their newest ships after her, the brand new HMS Calliope. The antiquated Ning Po was no match for the steel-built, steam-driven British battle cruiser, which promptly captured her in one of the very first actions of that ship's career. Well, the British now had her, and they decided that they were going to sell her at auction to the highest bidder, be it a tourist company, be it a museum, be it a private collector of antique ships. But no, the highest bidder were pirates. And she went right back into piracy. You really didn't think that one through, did you?
Legend has it that around the turn of the 1900s, she was smuggling opium out of China and into the United States, using Catalina Island as the dropping point for her goods, likely not too far from the point where she would eventually come to permanent rest. But we're not there yet.
Rebels captured her during the 1911 Battle of Yangtze, and they started stripping her of her armaments, her guns, and artifacts to sell on the black market. Well, an American heard about this, and he decided he wanted to step in and preserve the history of this ship, and he bought it from the rebels for $50,000 in 1911 money to keep what was left of it. And the plan at this point was to take the ship away from China. She's already been a terror. Bring her over to the United States, to Los Angeles specifically, where she would serve as a marvel of shipbuilding and a museum to her long history of terror. It was now 1912. At a time when the RMS Titanic was the newest ship in the world, the Ning Po was the oldest still functioning ship.
Getting her across the Pacific for this new lifestyle turned out to be quite a challenge, despite her having made this voyage a few times before. On her first 2 attempts to cross the sea, she was met with typhoons that severely crippled her. After the storm on the second voyage, her Chinese crew mutinied and refused to sail on. Some of the crew remained loyal and rowed the ship back to China, where the mutinous crew were arrested. A replacement crew of mostly British and Americans were hired, who sailed her the 7,000 miles from China to LA in just under 2 months.
She was moved around the Southern California area for a few years, being put on display and hosting tours in Venice Beach, Long Beach, and San Diego. Historical accounts say that she sank twice during this period, once off of Dead Man's Island, an island which no longer exists, and once off of San Diego. However, it's more appropriate to say that she swamped during this time. She flooded, and then sank a little bit in shallow water and just grounded there. Had it sank completely or been heavily damaged, it's not likely that her owners would have bothered salvaging her, but we know that they did. After her damage off Dead Man's Island, she was towed back to Long Beach and dry docked for repairs. She sustained minor damage to her bow during that wrecking, and one of the silver discs that represents an eye was removed, and behind that a chamber was discovered with a treasure inside of it, a silver plate with the inscription, "The Eye of the Dragon is bright and colorful." No one knows whatever became of that plate, and I don't think anyone ever figured out the meaning of that inscription.
After a 4-year stint between Los Angeles and San Diego, she was towed to Catalina Island off of Los Angeles, first sailing into Avalon and then brought to Lover's Cove, the first cove out of the town, anchoring offshore, and used as a Chinese restaurant named the Ning Po Cafe.
During this time, the ship took tourists on day trips to different parts of the island, becoming a backdrop for romantic getaways. Well, the food in the cafe must not have been all that good, because within a year, she stopped giving tours and the restaurant closed down.
Everybody keeps asking, well, now what do we do with her? She's like having a diamond, you know, it's too big to deal with, but you got to do something with her.
She was moved from Lover's Cove to Cat Harbor into the protection of Ballast Point.
Ballast Point was chosen because it is a protected area. Obviously, you could put any boat inside of here, and even if it got a little rough, which it does during the winter months, it's still protected.
Ballast Point is the oldest man-made structure on the island, being made of ballast stones from treasure galleons, anchoring here before raiding the mainland. It is a very fitting place to anchor the former pirate ship, and now the oldest vessel of the seas. Here, she became a museum and a tourist attraction.
Guests were charged a small fee, and then they were given a tour of the infamous vessel of torture and death.
Yeah, that's right. She was sensationalized. Her execution swords and beheading block were put on display front and center, and a torture chamber was mocked up in one of her cargo holds.
While the ship did undergo a heavy makeover for the showbiz aspect, great efforts were put into preserving the history of the vessel, and her curators boasted the fine Chinese craftsmanship that went into building her in a very honest and respectful way. The Great Depression hit the Catalina Island tourism industry very hard, especially the small, isolated, and quaint little museum of the Ning Po on the far corner of the island.
Yes, that's right. As you can see in this 1930s advertisement, the fearsome Ning Po was now being referred to as quaint.
The Ning Po attraction was closed, and shortly after, the ship was decimated by a series of storms, roughly in 1937. Now, here's another part of the ship's history where things get a little confusing.
Cat Harbor was the site of several film productions in the 1920s and 30s, seeing countless sailing ships coming into the harbor, and not all of them came out. Many were burned on film or destroyed for some dramatic climax. The Ning Po did not likely fall victim to these overeager film crews, but another ship was brought into the harbor and moored not too far from her. This ship was known as the Palmyra, and burned for the production of the 1935 film Mutiny on the Bounty.
Keep an eye out for another video on that ship on my channel in the future.
But the Palmyra is important for this story, as most recorded history of the Ning Po after 1930 seems to be heavily convoluted with the Palmyra. In 1952, the Explorer Sea Scouts, a youth group, rowed out to the charred remains of what they believed was the Ning Po, sawed off the mast, and hauled it ashore. They cut the mast up into tiny wood fragments and gave them out to hundreds of Boy Scouts at the Boy Scout Jamboree in 1953.
They sold off the remaining pieces as a fundraiser for their troop. Well, it turns out they hacked off the mast of the wrong shipwreck and passed off pieces of the Palmyra as the Ning Po. The dense wood that they believed was ironwood and camphor was really lignum vitae, a similarly dense wood, but not one found aboard the Ning Po.
The charred remains of the Palmyra were often, and still to this day, referred to as the old Chinese pirate ship. But what happened to the real Ning Po that sat only a few hundred feet away? Over the decades, the Ning Po slowly and mysteriously disappeared from Ballast Point. First her masts collapsed, and then her hull. She was picked over by salvagers who pulled wood off of her and made them up into trinkets and boxes. Dozens of artifacts were pulled off of her as she crumbled and are now in the hands of the Catalina Island Museum in Avalon, on the other side of the island.
We're very lucky to have postcards, so a lot of these pictures had to be hand-painted. I get the feeling that they have carried a consistency, so in other words, somebody literally took the time to make sure that her colors were right. They probably made these postcards available on the ship as souvenirs. I know they also had a program that the museum has, and I think they also sold that probably for 5 cents or whatever. She was a beautiful ship, but I could imagine seeing her under sail coming toward a British ship that it was a bit intimidating.
Now hardly anything remains of her. The rudder block still sticks up from the mud at low tide, and my friend and I discovered her keel and several ribs still buried on the site. She's there, but fading. Her ironwood, once impenetrable to cannon and shot, now rotten to the core and bored through by sea slugs. In addition to videos about some of the other ships in Catalina Harbor, including one specifically telling the story of the Palmyra, keep an eye out for another video focusing on surveying the harbor wrecks, including digging a bit deeper into what remains today of the Ning Po beneath the mud of Ballast Point.